And just to give you kind of an introduction to those, on your handout there is a page like this, what's called a stratigraphic column, with each of the formations in order. And I'm going to go through these a little bit just to hopefully get them a little bit familiar to you before we start seeing them everywhere. Now, the ones at the bottom here are way underneath us. We can't see them. Those are the Honaker Trail and the Paradox Formation. The Paradox is important because it has got salt in it, and that'll become kind of critical a little bit later on. The salt is basically formed in a very shallow seaway where it was so shallow that you had water evaporating off, and as water evaporated off, you had the salt concentration of the ocean go way up to the point that the salt was precipitating out and basically accumulating on the floor of the ocean over time. And so it ended up in the Paradox Formation turning into these layers of salt. Keep that in mind. Above those two is the Cutler Formation. We would have seen a little bit of that along the river, right down at river level. That's also pretty old. Above that, we move into the Triassic period, which includes the Moenkopi Formation and the Chinle. The Moenkopi and the Chinle were mostly at river level where we were yesterday. The Moenkopi predates dinosaurs, but dinosaurs appear in North America during the time period of the Chinle Formation.
Question. Those whitish layers near river level, the interbedded purple and whitish layers, is that the Moenkopi?
Those were probably in the Chinle.
Lower Chinle.
Yeah, the Moenkopi tends to be a kind of brick red layer.
Ah.
The gravel is either in the Cutler or at the base of the Chinle. The Chinle has a basal gravel called the Shinnerump member.
Ah, okay.
It's got a lot of wood in it, for example.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah. Now the Chinle is the same formation that Petrified Forest is in down in Arizona. So when you see the Chinle, you want to imagine a time of lakes and rivers and big forests and dinosaurs and other nastier reptiles running all over the place. And there are places up these canyons around Moab where you can find teeth and bones from those things all over the place in some of the conglomerate layers. If you want to see the Chinle here, you look straight over that way towards the horizon, and below the cliff there is a band that's kind of covered in mostly pinyon and juniper there, but the layer that's just below that big sandstone cliff is the Chinle.
The darker part?
Darker, yeah.
Yeah, the more shaly and less resistant to erosion?
Correct.
John, one of the aspects I've recently kind of tracked down is that this was almost equatorial.
Yes.
Not only in its climate, but in its location. Because this is ancient Pangaea before the continental drift that happened after this time. So we're down by the equator now. It's like, what?
Even quite a bit later than the Chinle, this part of North America was down at the latitude of around the Arizona-Mexico border, so it's 300 or 400 miles further south. So dinosaurs appear during the Chinle, lakes, rivers, forests. You go above the Chinle to that big cliff over there, and that is the Wingate Sandstone. That is the earliest part of the Jurassic period. That is the time when dinosaurs take over. In the Chinle, dinosaurs are neither abundant nor diverse, but they really take over the planet during the early Jurassic. And you have an environmental shift going on over there. The Wingate is basically petrified sand dunes. So you went from forests and lakes and everything to a big Saharan-type desert here with sand dunes all over the place. You don't find any bones of dinosaurs in the Wingate, but you find footprints all over the place. And hopefully if we have some time somewhere, we can kind of stop off and see one of these things somewhere along the way.
Are there any significant locations of dinosaur trackways in the Wingate that you know of?
Oh, yeah. There's some in Colorado National Monument. They're all over the place out here. Almost anywhere you go in Wingate, there are footprints.
Oh,
In
wow.
fact, one of the things I was doing a lot yesterday as we were floating along the river is staring up at the slopes of the Chinle, because these blocks of the Wingate sandstone fall out of the cliffs, they roll down and come to rest on the Chinle. And what you can do to find the tracks is just crawl around on the Chinle and check every sandstone block of Wingate. And every 200 or so, you'll find one with tracks on it. I didn't see any, but I'm sure there were some up there in the 7 or 8 miles that we did yesterday.
I've driven in the Moab area, John, before, and we'll just be on a random road that neither of us have ever been on, and John will say, hey, that's the perfect area for tracks, give me 5 minutes, and I'll find you a dinosaur track. And John's able to go out there and do it. They are so abundant out here when you know where to look. So, yeah, they're billions of tracks out here.
Yeah. In fact, if nothing else, there's one near the there's a spring at the intersection of Highway 191 and 128, which is right near where we cross over the river going back into town. There's one right there. So we can at least probably stop off at that thing. Okay, so you're in the sand dunes of the Wingate in the early Jurassic. When you move up to the top of those cliffs, you can't really see it, but we will be standing on it later today. At Dead Horse Point is the Kanta Formation. That is sand dunes and sandy braided rivers. That is also known from down in Arizona, and if anybody remembers Jurassic Park where Newman got spat on by the Dilophosaurus, that dinosaur came from the Kanta Formation down near Tuba City back in the 1950s. Moving up above that, we're into, you see all these kind of bumpy sandstone formations out here. It's kind of a lighter color, almost white. That is what's known as the Navajo sandstone. That's also early Jurassic in age. It is another sand dune desert, and it also has footprints all over it. There's a place up Potash Road here where there are tracks in big blocks that have fallen out of a cliff of the Navajo and landed on the Kanta, and there are slabs with 50 tracks on them, just all in one piece. So Navajo's also got a lot in it. We're next moving up into the Middle Jurassic, and that is basically what we're standing on right now is this thing called the Carmel Formation. The next 3 formations are Carmel, Entrada, and Curtis. That's if you're modern. I'm a little bit old school, and I call all 3 of these part of the Entrada Sandstone, and they are the Dewey Bridge member, the Slick Rock member, and the Moab member. Maybe we'll just call them by that so we don't have to get into the whole formational assignment controversy. So, the Dewey Bridge member is this stuff on the lower part of the cliff here where it's a little more thinly bedded and kind of wavy a little bit. See at the bottom? Basically the sheer cliff, you get down to the bottom, it's a little more broken up and there's a little more wavy bedding in it. That's the Dewey Bridge member. You can also see it at the bottom of this butte over here. And when you're coming up the road from the visitor center, you may have noticed it at the base of the cliffs there, and there are places where it's actually wavy, bent almost 180 degrees like this. Now, as we drive through the park, you'll see that a few other places. The balanced rock, which you see way off in the distance there, the lower pedestal of that thing is all Dewey Bridge member. So take a look at that as we drive around. You'll see that wavy bedding, and keep that wavy bedding in mind because that's very important for upheaval dome that we will see this afternoon.
So you will explain why it's wavy as opposed to
environmental difference.
One theory as to why it's like that. So it's basically when we get to upheaval dome, you won't be able to see the Dewey Bridge member, but keep in mind what you've seen here because that will kind of come into play this afternoon. Honestly, I'm not sure what the environment is for
Looks
the Dewey
like
Bridge
sloping
member.
on a continental slope. The whole layered thing tends to just slide. It keeps its layers, but gets kind of wavy as it slides and flushes along.
Yeah, it's a thing called soft sediment deformation. Basically, the bedding stays intact, but it kind of slumps and slides around like a wrinkled carpet. The question is why it's doing that, and I'll get into that then. So the big cliffs here, which we will see all throughout arches, and which are very important because this is what most of the arches are in, that is the slick rock member. And several years ago, there was a video of a Jeep that was driving around Moab and kind of lost its brakes and went careening down this cliff and came to the bottom and smashed in, and everybody was okay. But it was great watching that because, ironically, that Jeep was driving on the slick rock member of the Entrada, which, if you're going to go out of control, you should be on something called the slick rock.
So choose your sites carefully.
Yeah. Okay, now, all this, again, is Middle Jurassic in age, but that cliff of sandstone is, yet again, another big sand dune sea, like the Sahara. So that's all sand dunes. At the very top of that is the Moab member, and the Moab member is particularly important because that is the very top of the Moab member is what has what's called the Moab mega track site. There are literally dozens of track sites in the Moab member all around Arches National Park, almost in a big circle, and going all the way back up to Cisco towards Grand Junction. And there are probably hundreds of millions of tracks in this thing if you could see where it was buried under the surface and where it had been eroded off. The original surface was probably just crawling with tracks of carnivorous dinosaurs. Unfortunately, they're kind of hard to see because most of them are off on more remote roads, so we're more likely to be able to see tracks in the wind gate. Above the Moab member is the Morrison Formation, which we can't see here. We can talk about that a little bit later on if we do go in a direction where we're going to get up to it. And above that, we're getting into things like the Cedar Mountain Formation, Dakota, Manco Shale that we were driving on yesterday, but are 20 or 30 miles north of us. So, with the introduction of those formations, what I want to do is kind of go over what is hopefully a big picture explanation of the geologic reasons behind, yes.
Okay, we have slick rock, which is the kind of the straight thing.
Uh-huh.
Are the nodules on top the Moab? Is that what you're... the different little caps and things?
I think those are just layering in the slick rock. I'm not really seeing any Moab member right here. We'll probably see it elsewhere in the park, though. It tends to be a little more whitish colored than the slick rock. What I want to do is just kind of do a quick explanation here of why the landscape looks the way it does. And of course, the main reason it looks the way it does is because of erosion, but erosion is basically working with what the older geology left it to sculpt. And there are two main things in this area that kind of cause this to be more than just flat-lying rock that gets carved by the river and gravity. We will see that this afternoon out at Dead Horse Point and Canyonlands, but if not for some of these other factors, it would all be flat-lying like that. And because we have some topography here, things are a little bit more complicated, a little more interesting, really. So the first thing that we have that's kind of a factor in the landscape here is a thing called salt doming, which I'll explain. And the evidence of this that you can see is you can't see the town of Moab because it's down in a valley. And you can see the edge of that valley, which was kind of off when we were at the restaurant and the hotel and everything. Off to the west, there was a big cliff. And you can see that cliff running all the way along the western side of the Moab Valley. And the reason that that valley's there is because of salt doming, which, remember I mentioned the salt in the paradox formation, right? So you have a whole bunch of layers of rock here, and Zeb is going to hold it up so everybody can see it.
Salt, yeah, John.
You have a whole bunch of layers like this, and way down in the paradox you have this salt in kind of a layer here, and the salt is fairly buoyant, and it wants to work its way to the surface, and so what it tends to do is kind of glom together into these big, almost like bubbles of salt. So it starts out in a layer, kind of coalesces together, and then because it's so buoyant, it wants to start working its way up. And so as it does, it actually bulges all that sediment up, like that, and you have this big salt dome. I guess I'll take that out there. Kind of bulging its way up like that, right? So that's trying to work its way up. The problem, of course, is that salt, it's behaving almost like a liquid here, right? But because it's like a liquid, it has no strength to it. So it has the buoyancy to lift the rock up, but it doesn't have the strength to keep it supported. And so what happens is you have these, let's see, there we go. Basically, I have faults develop on either side of that, and this whole chunk of rock above collapses down and crashes in and smashes the salt dome, so that you end up with all those layers kind of dropped like this. You still have a little bit of salt underneath it, and then you have valley fill kind of coming in here. And so as you look down the Moab Valley, it's a little bit more steep on the west side than it is on the east, but that whole valley that you're seeing there is shaped like this because of that collapsed salt dome. So almost, well, the majority of the topography that you see around here is caused by that salt doming, and then the valleys are caused by that collapsing. So the Moab Valley is one of these structures. This uplift here of arches is all here because of a salt dome. And as we drive beyond Balanced Rock, the road will drop down several hundred feet into what's called the Salt Valley, which is another collapsed section of the Arches uplift, another salt dome. And then tomorrow when we drive through the Paradox Valley, which is over in Colorado, it's the same thing. And if you look at a map view of this area, here's the Utah-Colorado border, here's Moab over here, the LaSalles are here. You have Arches here, the Moab Valley like that, and the Paradox Valley like this. So they're all very long, maybe only a mile wide in some cases, and they're all trending kind of southeast to northwest.
Oh. Can I ask a question?
Yes.
What period of time are we talking about for this balloon thing to happen? This process.
You know, I don't know when the salt actually started working its way up, but I think most of the uplift and collapsing is probably sometime in the last few million years.
But I mean, it would take a long time for that salt to build up like that.
Oh, yeah.
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 Eons.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Yes.
I noticed in the valley they, have a lot of agriculture, the orchards and pears, and were those salt affecting the soil?
Not too bad, no. Most of the salt stays below the surface.
Okay.
Most of the alkaline problems that you have in the soil around here is because it's so dry.
Yeah.
And you have stuff it's out of the soil itself. It's not so much from the deeper stuff. And when we get to Dead Horse Point, the Paradox salt will come into play again. There's some stuff that we can see from Dead Horse Point related to mining of that salt, which is kind of a neat story.
And the salt came from the area that was the ocean?
Yep. Yeah.
John?
Yes.
Your explanation is really so great. And the idea of the alluvium that's on top of the salt there is what's protecting the farms.
Oh.
The soil and the gravels that have now filled in for who knows how deep. You might know. But that's what's protecting that soil from the salt. I can see that.
And there's also, in a lot of these, the sedimentary rock that collapsed down is also on top of the salt too. So there's a couple different layers that are above what was that dome. So I mentioned the La Salles here, which are kind of just east of Moab, and they're more circular. They don't really fit that elongate southeast to northwest pattern of the salt domes. And you can see the La Salles right there. That is the second factor that has affected this area, and although we can't see them, the La Salles are just one mountain range around here. They get up above 12,000 feet. They're a good 6,000 plus feet higher than we are. There are the Abajo Mountains, which are straight south of us, and the Henry Mountains, which are off to the southwest. And there are a lot of these isolated, almost circular mountain ranges in the Colorado Plateau that are a completely different origin from the salt dome topography. So this is the other main thing, and those mountain ranges are called laccoliths. And how that works, it's actually a similar kind of doming process. But in this one, you have a bunch of sedimentary rock, and you have magma down there, basically molten rock that is kind of down in this direction and starts working its way up, and it works its way up to a certain point, and then it finds a layer within or between formations that it really likes, and it starts spreading out this direction. And as more of that stuff works its way up and fills that in, here's your supply again coming up. And as it starts filling in more and more of this magma, it starts bulging up. And of course the layers above that end up bulging also.
And John, correct me if I'm wrong, but all this bulging is happening beneath the surface of the Earth. This doesn't break through the surface at this point, correct?
Correct. It may cause a little bit of an uplift, but at this point it's all underneath there. So here you have that magma, and sometimes people are told that the La Salles are volcanic, and in a sense, because they're related to magma formation, they're igneous, but they're not technically volcanic, because volcanic, of course, has to erupt and be either a big explosion or lava flows or something like that. As far as we know, these did not reach the surface, so there's no volcanic rock up there. It's igneous rock. So you then had all this magma solidify and turn into igneous rock. It's no longer molten, it's solidified. And if we kind of draw this on a larger scale, then what you have is your big dome with all these layers on it, all domed up.
So unlike the salt, it's not going to collapse. It's going to stay up.
Correct, because this, here's the laccolith, right? This is the big thing of igneous rock. There's a little supply tube to it, and you have more sedimentary rock underneath it. Sedimentary rock is relatively soft. Erosion will kind of melt through it pretty quickly. Igneous rock is much harder. So now we have that main force that I mentioned first off, erosion, working on, what the Earth has given it. And so erosion works all this stuff down, and it hits this igneous stuff, and it kind of slows down and doesn't get very far. And so what you're left with is these igneous rocks kind of lapping up where they've been pushed up by La Salles, but then, because that igneous rock is so much harder, it doesn't get very far on the laccolith, and you end up with that stuff more resistant, sticking up 6,000 plus feet higher than we are. And so that's why what we're standing on here is basically all this igneous rock that got pushed up a little bit on the edge of La Salles by the salt doming, and way above us here we have the mountains.
So you get a
It's
cool
kind of
laccolith there and then a salt formation over there. So
Yep.
you get kind of both of them happening in one area.
Yeah.
Cool. Really neat.
Hills and valleys.
Yep.
Hills and valleys.
So that's what causes those. LaSalle's, the Abajos, Henry